What if I told you that every cruise ship sailing right now has crew members carrying secrets that could destroy the industry? I'm Mr. Nightveil, and tonight I'm sharing 8 confessions from real cruise ship workers. For their protection, names and identifying details have been altered. But these stories are absolutely real. Have you ever been on a cruise ship? Drop your location and what time you're watching in the comments below. If you're ready to hear what really happens behind those cabin doors and below those decks, hit that subscribe button because you'll never look at cruise ships the same way again. My name is Luke, and I've been working night security on cruise ships for 12 years now. When people ask me what I do for a living, I tell them I walk the decks while everyone sleeps, make sure doors are locked, check on drunk passengers stumbling back to their cabins. What I don't tell them is that I see things at 3 in the morning that most people can't imagine. The ocean at night is a different world. Sound carries in ways that don't make sense. The darkness feels alive. And sometimes, in that darkness, things happen that the company makes sure nobody ever hears about. It was a Tuesday night, or maybe Wednesday morning depending on how you count it, somewhere in the Gulf of Mexico. We were 3 days into a 7-day Western Caribbean cruise, about 40 miles from the nearest land. I remember because I'd checked the navigation display during my midnight rounds. The ship was cutting through calm water, engines humming that low vibration you feel more than hear. Most of the passengers had gone to bed hours ago. The casino had closed at 2. The bars shut down at 2:30. By 3 a.m., the ship belonged to us, the night crew, and whatever ghosts lived in the machinery. I was doing my standard route that night. Start at the bow on deck 12, work my way aft, checking each deck as I go down. The upper decks are always my favorite part of the shift, when they're empty like that. No screaming kids, no drunk adults, no complaints about noise or missing towels. Just me, the wind, and the sound of water against the hull. I'd been walking the same route for so long, I could do it half asleep, which honestly I was most nights. 12 years of midnight to 8 a.m. shifts will do that to you. I was about halfway down deck 12 on the starboard side when I heard it. A sound that didn't fit. Not the usual metallic creaks or the wind or the distant hum of the engine. This was different. Wetter. Heavier. I stopped walking and listened. That's when I heard it again. A splash. Not like a wave hitting the hull, like something big hitting the water. I ran to the railing and looked down. The ship has lights that illuminate the water near the hull, and in that glow I saw him. A man, maybe 50 feet behind us already, arms flailing, head bobbing in the white wake the ship leaves behind. He was screaming. I could hear him even over the wind and the engine noise. He was screaming for help, and the distance between us was growing every second. I grabbed my radio and hit the emergency channel. My hands were shaking, but my voice came out steady, years of training kicking in. I reported a man overboard, gave my exact location, described what I saw. The bridge acknowledged immediately. I heard the alarm start to sound, that piercing wail that's supposed to wake the entire crew. I kept my eyes on the man in the water. He was still screaming, still trying to swim toward us, even though we were pulling away at 22 knots. I marked the position in my mind, tried to note any landmarks, even though there was nothing but dark water in every direction. Jackson showed up within 2 minutes. He was my shift supervisor, a guy who'd been working cruise ships even longer than me, maybe 20 years. He ran up to the rail where I was standing, and I pointed to where I'd last seen the man. The wake was still visible, but the man wasn't anymore. Jackson grabbed his radio and started coordinating. I heard him talking to the bridge, to the officer on watch. I heard him say they were initiating man overboard procedures, preparing to turn the ship around. Then, everything changed. Jackson's radio crackled, and a different voice came through. Not the bridge. Someone from corporate, patched in via satellite from Miami. I couldn't hear everything they were saying, but I could hear Jackson's responses. He kept saying, "Yes, sir, I understand, sir." And his face was getting harder with every word. He looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Not fear exactly. More like resignation. Like he knew what was coming and hated it, but was going to do it anyway. He pulled me away from the rail, away from the other crew members who were starting to gather. We walked to a section of deck where nobody could hear us over the wind. That's when Jackson told me what was about to happen. The man who went overboard was a passenger from Deck 7, traveling alone, a regular customer who'd been on the cruise line maybe a dozen times. They'd already pulled his records. He'd been drinking heavily in the casino earlier in the evening. The company had made a decision. The official story was going to be that this passenger was last seen leaving the casino around 2 a.m., heading toward his cabin. He never made it to his cabin. He was reported missing when he failed to show up for breakfast. We initiated a search. We never found him. The working theory would be that he was intoxicated, got disoriented, somehow made his way to an outer deck, and went overboard sometime between 2 and 6 a.m. when we discovered he was missing. I started to argue. I told Jackson I saw him go over. I saw exactly when it happened, exactly where. We could turn the ship around right now, get to that position in maybe 20 minutes. We had a chance. Jackson cut me off. He told me the decision had already been made. The company wasn't going to turn the ship around. They weren't going to initiate a proper search until dawn, which was 3 hours away. They weren't going to report the exact time of the incident because that would open them up to liability questions about response time. They needed this to be a tragedy, not a lawsuit. He told me I needed to write a report saying I never saw the man go overboard. I was doing my standard patrol. I never saw anything unusual. The first sign of a problem was when the passenger didn't show up for his scheduled breakfast seating, and his cabin steward reported him missing. Jackson would file a similar report. The bridge crew would file their reports saying the same thing. The timeline would show we did everything we could once we realized he was missing. We searched for 6 hours. We followed all protocols. It just wasn't enough to save him. I asked Jackson what happened to the emergency call I'd made. He said the logs were being adjusted. Technical glitch, radio malfunction. It happens all the time on ships. The official record would show the first alert came at 6:15 a.m., not 3:07 a.m. I stood there on that deck and I had a choice to make. I could refuse. I could insist on telling the truth. I could file my real report and let the company deal with it. But Jackson made it very clear what that choice meant. I'd be fired before we reached the next port. The company had lawyers who could bury me. I had no proof, no witnesses who would back me up. Nothing but my word against a billion-dollar corporation. And even if I fought it, even if I somehow made noise about it, that man was still dead. The ship wasn't turning around. The search wasn't happening for 3 more hours. My telling the truth wouldn't save him. It would just destroy my career. So I wrote the report the way they wanted it. I described my normal patrol route. I confirmed I saw nothing unusual. I stated that I was notified at approximately 6:20 a.m. about a missing passenger and immediately assisted in search procedures. I signed it and submitted it, and I hated every word. We did search for him. Starting at dawn, we had boats in the water, helicopters from the Coast Guard, the whole operation. We searched for 6 hours in an expanding grid pattern from where the ship had been when he was reported missing, not where he actually went overboard. We searched 40 miles from where I'd seen him go into the water. We never found him. We never had a chance of finding him. His family met the ship at Cozumel, his sister and his adult daughter. I had to stand there in my uniform while the captain expressed his condolences and explained how hard we'd searched, how we'd done everything possible. I had to look these women in the eyes, knowing that their brother and father had been screaming for help in the dark water while we sailed away from him, knowing that we'd had maybe a 10 or 15-minute window where we might have saved him if we'd acted immediately, knowing that the company had chosen to protect itself instead of trying to save his life. The daughter asked me directly if I'd seen anything that night. She had this desperate look in her eyes, like she needed to understand how it happened. I told her I was sorry, that I wished I'd seen something, anything that could have helped. I told her the lie I'd been ordered to tell. I watched her break down crying, and I wanted to tell her the truth so badly I could barely breathe. That was 9 months ago. I transferred to a different ship after that cruise, requested a move to day shift security. I couldn't walk those night decks anymore, couldn't stand at that rail on deck 12. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him in the water, getting smaller and smaller as we pulled away. I heard his screams. I still hear them. I'm off ships now entirely. Put in my resignation 6 weeks ago. I told them it was for personal reasons, that I needed to be on land for family stuff. The truth is, I couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't be part of a system that values public relations over human life. That man deserved a real chance. His family deserved the truth. Instead, they got a carefully constructed story designed to minimize corporate liability. I know why the company made that decision. Turning the ship around costs hundreds of thousands of dollars. Delaying the cruise schedule has cascading effects. Acknowledging we knew exactly when he went overboard opens questions about response time, about whether we did enough fast enough. It's easier and cheaper to make it a mystery, a tragic accident that couldn't be prevented. The family settled with the cruise line 3 months ago. I'm sure there was a non-disclosure agreement. I'm sure they got money in exchange for not asking too many questions. But I was there. I know what really happened. I know we had a chance, maybe a small one. But we had a chance. We had a man in the water at 3:07 a.m., and we knew exactly where he was. Instead of immediate action, we got 3 hours of corporate conference calls and timeline adjustments and carefully worded reports. By the time we started looking, he'd been in the water for 3.5 hours, drifting in currents we couldn't calculate, in an area we couldn't accurately search because we were pretending not to know when he went over. His name was printed in the ship newsletter the next day as a beloved returning guest. They held a memorial service on the pool deck. They said beautiful things about him. None of it mentioned that he died screaming in the dark while we sailed away and rewrote the story to protect the company. I stood at that memorial service in my uniform, and I couldn't even look at his picture. I still can't. My name is Misty, and I work the night shift as a cabin steward on one of the biggest cruise ships in the Caribbean fleet. 4 years I've been doing this job, cleaning rooms while passengers sleep, restocking towels and chocolates, turning down beds for the next evening. Most people think it's simple work, repetitive and boring. Walk the hallways between midnight and 6 in the morning. Service your assigned cabins. Avoid waking anyone up. What they don't understand is that ships have a different energy at night. The corridors feel longer. The sounds are different. And sometimes, the rooms you're assigned to clean aren't quite as empty as they should be. I have 32 cabins on my rotation, spread across decks 7 and 8. Interior rooms mostly, a few ocean view, the kind of standard accommodations that make up the majority of any cruise ship. I know every one of them by heart now. I know which cabins have families with small children who leave toys scattered everywhere. I know which couples are celebrating anniversaries and appreciate the extra attention to detail. I know which solo travelers barely touch their rooms except to sleep. After 4 years, you develop a rhythm. You learn to move through your work efficiently, professionally, invisibly. But there's one cabin that's never fit the pattern. Room 7043. It's an interior cabin on deck 7, starboard side, about halfway down the corridor. On paper, according to the ship's manifest system, it doesn't exist as a bookable room. When I check the passenger lists each night, 7043 never appears. The system shows it as vacant, marked with a code that means it's out of service for maintenance or renovation. But I'm assigned to clean it every single night, and it's never empty. The first time I noticed something wrong was during my second week on this ship. I was working my way through my evening checklist, entering each cabin with my master key, doing the turn-down service. When I opened 7043, I found personal belongings inside. A suitcase on the luggage rack, toiletries arranged on the bathroom counter, a book on the nightstand. The bed had been slept in, covers pulled back on one side, pillow still showing the indent of someone's head. I backed out immediately and checked my tablet. The room showed as vacant, no passenger assigned, no name on the booking. I reported it to my supervisor, Carter, thinking there'd been some kind of system error. Maybe someone had been assigned to the room, but it hadn't updated in our system yet. Carter looked into it and told me not to worry about it, just service the room as usual. He seemed uncomfortable when I pressed him about it, asked me to just do my job and not make it complicated. So I went back to 7043, changed the towels, straightened the belongings that were there, made the bed. The whole time I felt like I was intruding on someone's space, even though officially nobody was supposed to be staying there. The next night, the belongings were different. Not moved, different entirely. The suitcase was a different color. The toiletries were different brands. The book on the nightstand was a different title. I stood in that cabin trying to make sense of it. If someone was staying there, why would they completely change all their possessions in one day? I checked the system again. Still vacant. Still no passenger assigned. I cleaned the room and didn't mention it to anyone this time. This pattern continued for weeks. Every night, 7043 had signs of occupation. Sometimes the belongings changed. Sometimes they stayed the same for a few days, then shifted to something completely different. The bed was always slept in on the same side. Always that same indent in the pillow. I started paying closer attention to details. The belongings felt old-fashioned. The suitcase styles were dated. The kind you'd see in travel magazines from decades ago. The toiletries were brands I didn't recognize, in packaging that looked vintage. The books were old hardcovers with worn spines. Then one night, about 2 months into my assignment on this ship, I saw her. I'd entered 7043 for the evening service, using my key the same as always. The cabin was dimly lit by the bedside lamp, and sitting on the edge of the bed, wearing a green dress that looked like it belonged to another era, was an elderly woman. She had white hair pinned up in a neat bun, glasses on a chain around her neck. She looked up when I entered and smiled at me like she'd been expecting me. I froze. Every protocol I'd been trained on said there shouldn't be anyone in this room. But here was this woman, perfectly calm, perfectly real, sitting on the bed like she had every right to be there. I stammered out an apology, said I must have the wrong room, started to back out. The woman's smile didn't waver. She said, in a voice that sounded far away even though she was right in front of me, "Thank you, dear. You do such lovely work." I left that cabin so fast I nearly dropped my supply cart. My hands were shaking when I locked the door behind me. I radioed Carter immediately, told him there was a passenger in 7043, described the woman I'd seen. He sighed like I'd just created a problem for him and said he'd look into it. 20 minutes later, he found me in the corridor and told me he'd checked the cabin personally. It was empty. No passenger. No belongings. Nothing. He asked me if I was feeling all right, if maybe the night shift was getting to me, suggested I might want to take a break. But I knew what I'd seen. The woman had been real. She'd spoken to me. I'd seen the details of her dress, the pattern in the fabric, the way the light caught her glasses. That wasn't exhaustion or imagination. I went back to 7043 the next night, nervous about what I'd find. The belongings were there again. Different ones, but there. The bed was slept in. I serviced the room quickly. Didn't linger. The woman wasn't visible, but I felt watched the entire time. I started asking around, carefully, trying not to sound crazy. I talked to other night shift stewards, asked if they'd ever worked Deck 7, ever serviced 7043. Most of them looked at me blankly. The room wasn't on their manifests, but one woman, an older steward who'd been on ships for 15 years, pulled me aside one night during break. She told me she'd worked this ship 6 years ago. She'd been assigned to 7043 then too. She'd seen the woman in the green dress. She'd reported it just like I had. She'd been told the same thing, that the room was empty, that maybe she was overtired. That conversation changed everything because it meant I wasn't losing my mind. Someone else had experienced this. I started digging into the ship's history, trying to find information about 7043. The cruise line's internal database had limited historical records accessible to crew, but I found references to a passenger manifest from 8 years ago. A woman named Barbara had been staying in cabin 7043 during a 14-day Panama Canal cruise. Next to her name in the records was a notation in red text. Deceased on board. Natural causes. Day 11. Barbara had died in that cabin. She'd been elderly, traveling alone, and she'd passed away in her sleep. It was the only onboard death that year for our cruise line, a statistical rarity that got flagged in the records. After her death, the cabin had been taken out of the regular rotation. It was marked for deep cleaning and refurbishment. But according to the records I could access, that refurbishment never happened. The room just sat there, officially vacant, somehow still appearing on night shift cleaning assignments. I took this information to Carter, showed him what I'd found, told him about the other steward who'd seen the same woman. Carter got very quiet. He told me to follow him to his office, closed the door, and finally admitted the truth. 7043 wasn't a secret. Management knew about it. Night supervisors knew about it. The room appeared on cleaning manifests for night shift stewards as a test, a way to see who would handle the situation professionally and who would cause problems. The woman in the green dress had been seen by dozens of crew members over the years. Some stewards refused to service the room and had to be reassigned. Others, like me, just kept cleaning it. The company's position was simple. The room couldn't be rented to passengers because of its history. They couldn't remove it from the ship's physical layout. So it existed in this strange limbo, technically part of the ship, but not part of the bookable inventory. And yes, strange things happened there. Belongings appeared. The bed showed signs of use. Crew members reported seeing an elderly woman. The company didn't acknowledge it officially, didn't investigate it, didn't try to explain it. They just assigned people to keep the room serviced and told them not to ask questions. Carter made it clear that my job depended on accepting this arrangement. Service 7043. Don't talk about what I saw there. Don't try to make it into a bigger issue. The company had protocols for dealing with crew members who couldn't handle the supernatural aspects of working on old ships. Those protocols usually ended with reassignment to less desirable positions or quiet termination. So I kept cleaning 7043, night after night for the past 3 years. Sometimes Barbara is visible, sitting on the bed or standing by the window. Sometimes she's not. Sometimes she speaks to me, always polite, always thanking me for my work. Sometimes the room is silent. The belongings continue to change in ways I can't explain. To treat it like any other cabin on my rotation, other night shift stewards have confirmed they've had similar experiences. We don't talk about it openly, but in quiet conversations during breaks, we compare notes. We've all seen her. We've all felt that strange atmosphere in the room. Some crew members think she's harmless, just a presence that doesn't understand she's passed on. Others think the room itself is somehow stuck in time, replaying moments from that final cruise 8 years ago. Nobody really knows. What bothers me most isn't seeing Barbara, as strange as it sounds. What bothers me is what happened 3 nights ago. I entered 7043 for the evening service, and she was there, sitting in the chair by the window. She looked at me and smiled. same as always. But then she said something that made my blood go cold. She asked me when we'd be arriving in Cozumel. Said she was looking forward to the port day, wanted to do some shopping. The ship hasn't sailed to Cozumel in 5 years. We changed our route. Cozumel isn't on our itinerary anymore. Like she was still on that cruise from 8 years ago, still making plans for ports we'd never visit. I didn't know what to say to her. I just finished my work and left. I've put in a request for transfer to day shift. I can't do this anymore. It's not just about seeing a ghost or cleaning a haunted room. It's about the fact that this woman is trapped somehow, reliving a cruise that ended 8 years ago. And the company just wants us to keep cleaning around her like it's normal. Barbara deserved better than dying alone in a cabin, and then being ignored for nearly a decade while her presence got treated like a maintenance issue. I don't know if my transfer will be approved. I don't know if leaving night shift will change anything. But I needed to tell someone the truth about 7043. That room exists. Barbara exists, in whatever form ghosts or memories or trap time takes. And every night, crew members on this ship walk into that cabin and pretend everything is normal, while a dead woman thanks them for changing her towels. Have you ever felt a presence in a hotel room or cabin that made you think someone else was there with you? Drop your answer below because I'm curious if passengers experience things we crew members are told to keep quiet about. My name is Wyatt, and for 7 years I worked as an assistant engine mechanic in the bowels of cruise ships. When passengers think about cruises, they picture pools and buffets and ocean views. They don't think about the men working in 120-degree heat, 4 decks below the waterline, keeping the engines running so those pools stay filled and those buffets stay lit. They definitely don't think about what happens when corporate pressure meets impossible deadlines and safety becomes negotiable. I'm here to tell you about the day my best friend died because cutting corners was cheaper than doing things right. Working engine rooms on cruise ships isn't like regular maritime work. Cargo ships give you time. Container vessels have maintenance windows built into their schedules. Cruise ships never stop. We'd pull into port at 7 in the morning. Passengers would flood off for their excursions, and we'd have maybe 8 hours to complete repairs that should take 3 days. Then, passengers would flood back on. The ship would sail at 5 in the evening, and whatever wasn't finished had to wait until the next port, or get done while we were underway. The pressure was constant, relentless, and completely unsustainable. I met Thomas during my second contract on the Meridian Explorer, one of the fleet's older ships that ran Western Caribbean routes. He'd transferred from a cargo vessel, thinking cruise work might be easier, better pay, more stable. We both learned pretty quick that cruise ships chewed through engine crew faster than any other department. The heat alone was enough to break most people. Add in the noise, the tight spaces, the chemical exposure, and the impossible schedules, and you understood why engine mechanics rarely lasted more than a few years. Thomas and I became friends because we were both trying to make the work sustainable. We followed safety protocols, even when supervisors told us to skip steps. We documented problems properly instead of just patching things and moving on. We pushed back when we were told to do things that violated basic maintenance procedures. That made us unpopular with management, but it kept us alive, or so we thought. The incident happened on a turnaround day in Cozumel. We'd been having issues with the number 3 turbine system for 2 weeks. Nothing catastrophic but concerning. Vibrations that shouldn't be there, temperature fluctuations, unusual sounds during operation. I'd written it up multiple times. Thomas had flagged it independently. We both recommended taking the turbine offline for a full inspection and servicing. That would mean running on reduced power for several days, maybe limiting the ship's speed, possibly even canceling a port stop if we couldn't maintain schedule. Management denied the request. We were told the turbine was fine, the readings were within acceptable parameters, and we'd address it during the next dry dock in 4 months. In the meantime, we had a minor repair to complete during the Cozumel turnaround. A seal replacement that should have been simple. Get in, swap the part, test the system, get out. 3 hours maximum if we followed proper procedure. That morning, our supervisor Maverick called us into his office before the port opened. He had the work order for the turbine seal, but he also had additional instructions that weren't written down anywhere. Corporate wanted us to complete the repair in 90 minutes instead of 3 hours. The ship was on a tight schedule, and they couldn't afford any delays. To make that timeline work, we needed to bypass some safety protocols. Specifically, Maverick told us to disable the automatic shutdown systems on the turbine while we worked on it. Those systems were designed to kill power instantly if sensors detected dangerous conditions. Temperature spikes, pressure changes, anything that indicated potential failure. The problem was that disabling those systems required powering down the entire turbine assembly, running diagnostic checks, then bringing it back online afterward. That process alone took 90 minutes. If we skipped it, we could do the seal replacement with the turbine running at reduced power, finish in an hour, and have the ship ready to sail on time. I said no immediately. Told Maverick that working on an active turbine with disabled safety systems was insane. If something went wrong, if the seal didn't seat properly, or if there was pressure in the lines we hadn't accounted for, the automatic shutdowns were the only thing that would prevent a catastrophic failure. Thomas backed me up. We both refused to do the work under those conditions. Maverick got quiet in a way that scared me more than if he'd started yelling. He told us that we could either complete the repair the way he'd outlined, or we could pack our things and be off the ship by the time passengers returned from their excursions. He'd already cleared it with the chief engineer and with corporate. They had a list of mechanics waiting for positions. We were replaceable. Thomas had 2 kids back home in Texas. His daughter had just started high school. His son needed braces. He was sending most of his paycheck back to his family every month. He couldn't afford to lose this job. I watched him struggle with the decision, saw the exact moment he broke. He told Maverick he'd do it. I should have walked away right then, should have refused and taken the consequences. Instead, I told Thomas I'd help him, told myself I could keep him safe, that 2 of us working together could manage the risks better than him working alone. We spent 20 minutes reviewing the procedure, planning every step, identifying every possible point of failure. We had emergency protocols ready. We positioned fire suppression equipment within reach. We did everything we could to mitigate the danger we were about to put ourselves in. Then we disabled the safety systems and started the repair. For the first 40 minutes, everything went smoothly. We removed the housing, accessed the damaged seal, prepared the replacement part. Thomas was doing the detailed work because his hands were steadier than mine. I was assisting, managing tools, monitoring gauges, watching for any sign of problems. The turbine was running at 30% power, just enough to maintain pressure in the system while we worked. The temperature was holding steady. Everything seemed under control. Thomas had just seated the new seal and was tightening the housing bolts when something shifted. I saw it on the pressure gauge first. A spike, sudden and sharp. I yelled at him to get clear, but he was in an awkward position, half inside the access panel, tools still in his hands. He started to pull back, but he wasn't fast enough. The seal failed. Not the new one he'd just installed. A different seal, one we hadn't touched, weakened by weeks of the vibration issues we'd been reporting. High-pressure fluid exploded into the compartment, superheated, under enough force to tear metal. Thomas took the full blast. I lunged for the emergency shutoff, the manual override that should have killed power to the system. Maverick had told us it was still functional even with the automatic systems disabled. He'd lied. The manual override had been disconnected to speed up the bypass process. I ran to the main breaker panel, 20 feet away. Had to dodge around equipment, squeeze through tight spaces. I could hear Thomas screaming the entire time. By the time I killed the power and got back to him, it had been 4 minutes. 4 minutes of scalding fluid and mechanical force and no automatic systems to stop it because we'd turned them all off to meet a schedule. Thomas died before the medical team even reached the engine room. There was nothing anyone could have done at that point. The ship's doctor tried, but the injuries were too severe, too extensive. I sat there on the deck plates, covered in hydraulic fluid and blood, watching them work on my friend, knowing that every safety system designed to prevent exactly this scenario had been intentionally disabled because corporate couldn't accept a 2-hour delay. The investigation started within hours. Corporate sent a team. Maritime authorities got involved because any onboard death triggers regulatory review. I gave my statement, told them exactly what had happened, what Maverick had ordered us to do, why the safety systems had been disabled. I expected immediate action. Instead, I watched the story get rewritten in real time. The official report came out 3 weeks later. It stated that Thomas had failed to follow proper maintenance procedures, that he hadn't been adequately trained on the turbine systems despite having 2 years of experience with them, that he'd bypassed safety protocols on his own initiative to complete the work faster. The report mentioned nothing about Maverick's orders, nothing about the corporate pressure to meet impossible timelines, nothing about the systemic safety violations that had been standard practice in the engine department for years. Maverick called me into his office and put a document in front of me. A statement confirming the official report's findings. If I signed, I kept my job, got transferred to a different ship with a pay increase for my cooperation. If I refused to sign, I'd be terminated for insubordination and flagged in the industry database as a problem employee. I'd never work on ships again. I signed it. I tell myself I had no choice. I tell myself that fighting it wouldn't have brought Thomas back, wouldn't have changed anything except destroying my own career. But the truth is, I was scared and I was tired, and I didn't think I could win against a company that size, so I put my name on a lie that blamed my dead friend for his own death. The company settled with Thomas's family 4 months later, paid them enough money to keep quiet, made them sign agreements that prevented them from talking about the incident or pursuing further legal action. His kids got a college fund and a dead father and a story about how he made a tragic mistake. They never learned that their dad had tried to do things the right way, that he'd only agreed to the unsafe procedure because he was threatened with losing his job, that the company had known for weeks about the equipment problems and had chosen to ignore them. I transferred to a different ship like they promised. Worked another 8 months before I couldn't take it anymore. Every time I walked into an engine room, I saw Thomas. Every time a supervisor told me to cut corners or skip safety steps, I heard his screams. I put in my resignation and moved back to land-based work. The pay is worse, but I sleep better. The worst part is knowing this wasn't unique. Engine room accidents happen on cruise ships more often than passengers realize. Most don't result in deaths, so they never make the news. Equipment failures, injuries, close calls, all of it buried under corporate policies that prioritize schedules and profits over the people keeping those massive engines running. Every ship I worked on had similar stories. Mechanics forced to choose between their safety and their jobs. Maintenance deferred until problems became catastrophic. Investigations that blamed workers instead of examining the systemic issues that put them in danger. Thomas's real maintenance logs, the ones where he documented all the problems with that turbine system, disappeared from the ship's database within a week of his death. The replacement logs showed routine maintenance, with no significant issues reported. His written reports vanished. My written reports vanished. The paper trail that would have proven the company knew about the dangers just stopped existing. I kept copies of everything, printed them out before they could be deleted, stored them in my personal belongings. I don't know what I'm going to do with them. Part of me wants to send them to maritime safety organizations, blow the whole thing open. Part of me knows that won't change anything. The industry is too big, too powerful, too good at protecting itself. One dead mechanic won't shift policies that have been in place for decades. But Thomas deserves better than being remembered as the guy who made a fatal mistake. He was careful and skilled, and he died because a corporation decided that keeping to a schedule was worth more than his life. His family deserves to know that. The mechanics still working those engine rooms deserve to know that when they're told to disable safety systems and work under dangerous conditions, they're not the first, and they won't be the last. I'm telling this story because I can't carry it alone anymore. Because every time I see a cruise ship in port, I think about the crew members 4 decks down, working in impossible heat under impossible pressure, being told that their safety is negotiable. Thomas was my friend, and I failed him. I helped him do the work that killed him, and then I signed paperwork that blamed him for it. That's something I have to live with forever. If you've ever worked in an industry where you were pressured to ignore safety rules to meet deadlines, tell me about it in the comments, because I need to know this isn't just happening on ships. My name is Miles, and I've been pouring drinks on cruise ships for 9 years. Started as a barback when I was 23. Worked my way up to senior bartender. Now I run the main lounge and pool deck bars on one of the biggest ships in the fleet. People think bartending is about mixing cocktails and making small talk. On cruise ships, it's about reading people, managing crowds, staying alert for 12-hour shifts, and watching patterns that most passengers never notice. The problem is, I've been watching the same disturbing pattern repeat itself for years, and nobody with the power to stop it seems to care. Cruise ships have a drinking culture unlike anywhere else. Open bar packages mean people consume alcohol from the moment they wake up until they pass out at night. Nobody's driving home. Nobody has work in the morning. Inhibitions drop fast when you're on vacation in the middle of the ocean. As bartenders, we see people at their worst. The fights, the breakdowns, the bad decisions. We become amateur therapists, bodyguards, and babysitters all at once. You learn to spot trouble before it starts. You learn who needs to be cut off, who needs water, who needs an escort back to their cabin. But there's a type of trouble I started noticing during my 3rd year working ships, and once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Certain male crew members, always in passenger-facing roles, have a hunting pattern. They target women traveling alone or in small groups. They're friendly, helpful, attentive. They recommend drinks, buy rounds, keep the conversation going. They wait until their targets are drunk enough to be vulnerable but not so drunk that it's obvious to everyone watching. Then they offer to help these women back to their rooms. Except they don't always take them to passenger areas. The first time I witnessed it clearly was during a 7-day Caribbean sailing. There was a woman at the pool bar, mid-30s, traveling solo, celebrating a divorce. She'd been drinking steadily since lunch. Nothing extreme, just maintaining a nice buzz, enjoying her freedom. One of the assistant cruise directors, a guy named Isaac, started paying attention to her around 4 in the afternoon, complimenting her, asking about her story, being charming in that practiced way cruise staff perfect over years of working crowds. I watched Isaac buy her drinks for 3 hours, watched him gradually shift from friendly conversation to physical contact. Hand on her shoulder, arm around her waist, standing closer. She was receptive, laughing, clearly enjoying the attention. By 7 that evening, she could barely stand. Isaac told her he'd walk her back to her cabin. She agreed, leaning on him heavily as they left the pool deck. Something felt wrong about the whole interaction. The way Isaac had deliberately kept her drinking. The way he'd isolated her from the other passengers who'd been part of her conversation earlier. The practiced efficiency of it. I mentioned it to my bar manager, asked if we should check on her. He told me Isaac was just being helpful, that cruise directors assist drunk passengers all the time, that I should mind my own business. The woman showed up at the bar the next afternoon looking confused and upset. She asked me if I'd seen her leave the night before, if I remembered who she'd been with. She had gaps in her memory, couldn't remember getting back to her cabin, woke up with bruises she couldn't explain. I told her she'd left with Isaac, one of the cruise directors. She went to guest services to file a complaint. I never heard what came of it, but I started paying closer attention after that. Started noticing Isaac's pattern repeating. He'd target a different woman every few cruises. Always solo travelers or women separated from their groups. Always the same gradual escalation of drinks and attention. Always the offer to help them back to their rooms when they were too drunk to walk straight. I mentioned it to other bartenders. They'd noticed too. We started calling him and guys like him the hunters. There were others. A photographer who worked the same pattern, using the excuse of wanting to show women exclusive photo locations to get them alone. An excursion manager who volunteered for late-night shifts and somehow always ended up helping intoxicated women. A waiter from one of the specialty restaurants who had a reputation among bar staff for showing up at the nightclub around midnight looking for targets. We all knew who these guys were. We talked about them during shift changes, warned each other, tried to intervene when we could. The intervention part was tricky. We started cutting women off earlier if we saw one of these crew members paying too much attention. We'd water down drinks, suggest food, encourage groups to stay together. When possible, we'd walk passengers back to their cabins ourselves, rather than let them go with crew members we didn't trust. We developed hand signals, ways to communicate across the bar that someone needed watching. It wasn't enough. The cruise ship environment gave these guys too many advantages. They had authority. They had access to crew areas where passengers weren't supposed to go. They knew the security camera blind spots. They understood that drunk passengers made unreliable witnesses. And they knew the company would protect them over protecting passengers if it came down to he said, she said situations. The breaking point for me came about 2 years ago. I was working the late shift at the main lounge, the bar that stays open until 2 in the morning for the diehards who don't want the party to end. There was a young woman, maybe 25, absolutely wasted. She'd been celebrating her bachelorette party with friends, but they'd all gone to bed hours earlier. She'd stayed at the bar, kept drinking, and was now slumped over the counter, barely conscious. Isaac appeared out of nowhere. Told me he'd take care of her, get her back to her cabin safely. I'd been watching this guy's pattern for 3 years by this point. I knew exactly what taking care of her meant. I told him I'd handle it, that I'd already radioed security to do a cabin escort. That was a lie, but I needed him gone. Isaac got aggressive, told me to stay in my lane. That passenger assistance was his job, not mine. We had a confrontation right there at the bar that got loud enough to attract attention. Security did show up, but not because I'd called them. Someone had reported our argument. The security officer who arrived was someone I'd worked with before. A decent guy named Gabriel who actually cared about doing his job right. I explained the situation quickly, pointed out how drunk the woman was, explained that Isaac had a history of targeting intoxicated female passengers. Gabriel took over, called for a female security officer to escort the woman back to her room, and told Isaac his services weren't needed. I thought that would be the end of it. Instead, I got called into a meeting with my supervisor and a representative from Human Resources the next morning. They told me I'd overstepped my authority, that I'd interfered with another crew member performing his duties, that I'd made serious accusations without evidence. Isaac had filed a complaint against me for harassment and defamation. The woman I'd been trying to protect had no memory of the incident and couldn't provide any statement supporting my version of events. I was given a written warning and told that one more incident of interfering with crew member personal time would result in termination. Personal time. They called it personal time. Isaac was helping a barely conscious passenger back to her room, and they classified it as his personal time that I'd interfered with. The implication was clear. What crew members did with drunk passengers was their business, as long as it didn't create official complaints that the company couldn't ignore. Isaac got transferred to a different ship 2 months later. Not fired, not disciplined, just moved. I found out later through the crew network that he'd been moved before, multiple times, always after situations involving female passengers and alcohol. The company's solution to the problem was to shuffle these guys around the fleet, give them fresh hunting grounds, and hope they'd be careful enough not to create incidents that required official responses. Gabriel and I started comparing notes after that. He'd been noticing the same patterns from the security side. Women filing complaints about crew members that went nowhere. Investigation reports that concluded encounters were consensual, even when the women involved had been blackout drunk and couldn't consent to anything. Crew members with multiple complaints in their files who were still working, still in passenger-facing roles, still targeting vulnerable women. The system was designed to protect the company, not the passengers. Drunk passengers made bad witnesses. If there was no physical evidence, no clear proof of assault, the company could claim consensual encounter and avoid liability. Easier to settle quietly with anyone who pushed hard enough to threaten legal action. Easier to transfer crew members than to fire them and risk wrongful termination lawsuits. Easier to ignore the pattern than to acknowledge they had predators working their ships. We tried to work within the system. Gabriel filed reports documenting the patterns he was seeing. I reported my observations through proper channels. Other bartenders, cabin stewards, security officers who'd witnessed similar behaviors added their voices. Nothing changed. The reports were acknowledged and filed and forgotten. The same crew members kept working. The same patterns kept repeating. I watched it happen again and again. Women coming to the bar asking about the night before, trying to piece together missing hours. Women with bruises, with that look in their eyes that said something had happened but they couldn't prove it. Women who filed complaints and then got pressured to withdraw them because the investigation found insufficient evidence, and pursuing it further would ruin their vacation. Women who were told they'd had too much to drink and maybe they were confused about what had actually occurred. The bar staff developed our own protection system. We watch for the hunters. We intervene however we can. We walk passengers ourselves rather than let certain crew members volunteer. We document everything in informal logs that the company doesn't see. We warn each other when someone we don't trust shows up looking for targets. It's not enough, but it's all we can do without losing our jobs. 3 months ago, Isaac got promoted. He's now training new assistant cruise directors, teaching them passenger interaction, conflict resolution, guest services. They know about the complaints, the transfers, the pattern. They promoted him anyway, because he's good at his job in the ways they care about. He gets high guest satisfaction ratings. He handles difficult situations smoothly. What he does to vulnerable women in his spare time apparently doesn't matter as long as it doesn't create legal problems. I'm still working bars, still watching, still intervening when I can. But I'm tired. Tired of being the only barrier between predators and their targets. Tired of fighting a system that doesn't want to acknowledge the problem. Tired of looking at women enjoying their vacations and knowing that some of them won't make it through the week without becoming victims of crew members who've learned exactly how to exploit the cruise ship environment. The company markets these cruises as safe, family-friendly vacations. They sell romance and adventure and freedom. They don't mention that some of their crew members view drunk female passengers as opportunities. They don't talk about the complaints that get buried, or the investigations that go nowhere, or the predators who get shuffled between ships instead of fired. They certainly don't acknowledge that bartenders and security officers have to maintain informal protection networks because the official systems fail passengers over and over again. I keep doing this job because I can make a difference for some people. Every woman I cut off early, every passenger I walk back myself, every time I block one of the hunters from accessing their target. That's someone who gets home safe. It's not enough. It should never be my responsibility alone. But until the company decides passenger safety matters more than avoiding lawsuits and protecting crew members who bring in good performance reviews, this is what we've got. Have you ever felt uncomfortable with how a crew member or service worker was treating you or someone you know while you were drunk or vulnerable? And if so, did you report it? My name is Rachel, and I've been working as a ship medical officer for 6 years now. I came from emergency medicine, spent 8 years in busy urban hospitals dealing with trauma, overdoses, heart attacks, the full spectrum of medical emergencies. I thought transitioning to cruise ship medicine would be a step down in intensity, a chance to use my skills in a less chaotic environment while seeing the world. What I didn't understand was that ship medicine comes with pressures that have nothing to do with patient care and everything to do with corporate liability and profit margins. Ship medical centers aren't real hospitals. We have basic equipment, limited medications, small staff. On my ship, it's me as the sole physician, 2 nurses, and a medical assistant for nearly 4,000 passengers and 1,500 crew members. We can handle minor issues well enough. Seasickness, cuts requiring stitches, food poisoning, sprained ankles, the occasional cardiac event that we stabilize before arranging evacuation. What we can't handle are situations that require hospital-level resources, and we definitely can't handle public health crises that need coordinated response with shoreside authorities. The norovirus outbreak started on day 3 of what was supposed to be a 10-day cruise through the Eastern Caribbean. I saw the first cases that morning during sick call. A family of 4, parents and 2 teenagers, all presenting with severe gastric symptoms, vomiting, diarrhea, fever, the classic presentation. I treated them symptomatically, gave them anti-nausea medication, started them on fluid replacement, and sent them back to their cabin with strict hygiene instructions. I documented it as probable viral gastroenteritis and moved on to the next patients. By that afternoon, I had 12 more cases, different cabins, different deck locations, but all the same symptoms with the same rapid onset. That's when I knew we had a problem bigger than random food poisoning. I ran the checklist for norovirus, confirmed the symptom patterns matched, and immediately contacted the corporate medical department via satellite. Protocol required me to report any suspected outbreak within 6 hours of identification. I was reporting within 4. The corporate medical officer I spoke with was a doctor named Caleb, someone I'd dealt with before on smaller issues. I explained the situation clearly. We had a confirmed norovirus outbreak starting to spread through the passenger population. I recommended immediate enhanced sanitation protocols, passenger notification, and, most importantly, notification to port authorities at our next stop, so we could arrange for passengers who wanted to disembark early and get proper medical care if needed. I also suggested we might need to consider cutting the cruise short if the outbreak escalated. Caleb told me to hold on implementing anything beyond basic sanitation. He needed to consult with the corporate team and would get back to me within 2 hours. I spent those 2 hours treating an increasing flow of sick passengers. By dinner time, I had 40 cases documented. The outbreak was spreading fast, which is typical for norovirus in closed environments like cruise ships. The virus is incredibly contagious, spreads through surfaces and air particles, and thrives in exactly the conditions cruise ships provide. When Caleb called back, his instructions were clear and they horrified me. I was to manage the outbreak quietly. Enhanced cleaning protocols were approved, but I was not to make any general announcements that would alarm passengers. I was not to contact port authorities ahead of our scheduled arrival. I was absolutely not to recommend early disembarkation or suggest cutting the cruise short. The company's position was that we could manage the situation on board, that creating panic would make things worse, and that involving port authorities would result in denied entry, which would cascade into a scheduling disaster affecting multiple future cruises. I argued with him for 20 minutes, pointed out that passengers had a right to know there was an outbreak, that people with compromised immune systems or underlying health conditions needed to make informed decisions about their exposure risk, that port authorities needed advance warning so they could prepare proper medical response, that we were looking at potentially hundreds of sick people with only 3 medical staff and limited resources. Caleb's response was that this was a corporate decision, not a medical one. My job was to treat patients and manage symptoms. The company's job was to handle communications and logistics. If I felt I couldn't follow these instructions, they could arrange for a replacement physician to be flown in at the next port. I understood what that meant. Cooperate or lose my position, so I cooperated. I treated patients as they flooded into the medical center. I watched the outbreak spread exactly as I'd predicted it would. By day 5, I was seeing over 60 new cases per day. We ran out of anti-nausea medication. We ran low on IV fluids. I had passengers lying on gurneys in the hallway because we didn't have enough treatment rooms. The nursing staff was working 16-hour shifts trying to keep up. Among the sick passengers was an elderly man named Cooper, 78 years old, traveling with his wife to celebrate their 50th anniversary. He came to the medical center on day 6, severely dehydrated from 3 days of symptoms. He'd been trying to tough it out in his cabin, didn't want to ruin the cruise his wife had been planning for months. By the time I saw him, he was in bad shape. Dangerously dehydrated, electrolyte imbalances, blood pressure dropping, kidney function compromised. I got Cooper on IV fluids immediately, started monitoring his vitals closely. He needed hospital care, real hospital care with full lab capabilities, proper imaging, the ability to manage complications if his condition deteriorated. I called Caleb again, explained that I had a critically ill elderly patient who needed evacuation. Recommended we arrange helicopter transport to the nearest hospital, which would take maybe 3 hours to coordinate. Caleb denied the request, said that Cooper's condition was manageable with the resources I had available, that arranging emergency evacuation would require notifying Coast Guard, which would trigger questions about why we had a medical emergency of this severity. Those questions would lead to discovery of the outbreak we'd been managing quietly for 3 days. Better to stabilize Cooper on board, monitor him closely, and if he was still critical when we reached port in 2 days, we could arrange discreet transport to a hospital then. I told Caleb that 2 days might be too long. That Cooper's age and condition meant he could decline rapidly. That in a real hospital, he'd be in intensive care right now with specialists monitoring him. Caleb repeated that I had the resources to manage the situation and that evacuation was denied due to the broader implications for the cruise and the company. I did everything I could with what I had. Kept Cooper on continuous IV fluids, monitored his vital signs every 30 minutes, adjusted his treatment as his condition fluctuated. His wife stayed with him in the medical center, holding his hand, talking to him. She kept asking me if he was going to be okay. I told her we were doing everything possible, which was true but incomplete. We were doing everything possible within the constraints the company had placed on me. What I didn't tell her was that everything possible wasn't the same as everything necessary. Cooper died on the morning of day 7. His heart gave out, stress from the dehydration and electrolyte imbalances overwhelming a system already weakened by age. I performed CPR for 40 minutes, even though I knew it was futile. His wife screamed and collapsed. The nurses had to sedate her. I had to go to my office afterward and write a death certificate that listed cardiac arrest as the cause of death, which was technically accurate, but missed the entire context of why his heart had stopped. The company's crisis management team was on the phone within an hour of Cooper's death. They wanted to know every detail, not because they cared about what had gone wrong, but because they needed to manage the liability. I was instructed on exactly what to include in my official reports. Cooper had presented with viral gastroenteritis, a common cruise ship illness. He'd been treated appropriately with the resources available. His death was the result of underlying cardiac conditions exacerbated by illness. A tragic outcome, but not one that indicated any failure of care. What I wasn't supposed to include in my reports was that I'd recommended evacuation and been denied, that Cooper might have survived with proper hospital care, that the company had prioritized avoiding publicity over providing optimal patient care. All of that was considered privileged corporate communication, not relevant medical information. The outbreak was finally reported to CDC when we reached port on day 8. By then we'd sanitized the ship extensively. The case count was declining, and the immediate crisis had passed. CDC did their investigation, documented the outbreak, added it to their statistics. The cruise line got a violation notice and had to submit a corrective action plan. Nobody mentioned Cooper's death in connection with the outbreak response. He was just an unfortunate elderly passenger who'd had a heart attack during his cruise. The company settled with Cooper's family 6 months later. I don't know the terms, but I'm certain there was a non-disclosure agreement involved. His wife accepted whatever they offered, signed whatever they asked her to sign. She was 76 years old, grieving. Probably didn't have the energy or resources to fight a prolonged legal battle against a corporation with unlimited legal resources. I stayed on for another year after that cruise. Kept working, kept treating passengers, kept following corporate protocols that prioritized company interests over patient welfare. But I couldn't get Cooper's death out of my head, couldn't stop thinking about the moment I'd called for evacuation and been told no. Couldn't stop wondering if he'd still be alive if I'd pushed harder, if I'd threatened to resign, if I'd gone over Caleb's head to someone with more authority. The truth is, it probably wouldn't have mattered. The decision to manage the outbreak quietly wasn't Caleb's decision alone. It came from executives who'd calculated that the cost of bad publicity, denied port entries, and refunded cruises was higher than the risk of medical complications from delaying proper response. They'd run the numbers and decided that managing things quietly was worth the gamble. Cooper lost that gamble. I'm off ships now, working at a community hospital back on land where my medical decisions are actually medical decisions, not corporate strategy. The pay is worse, but I can sleep at night. Most nights, anyway. I still think about Cooper sometimes, about his wife holding his hand in the medical center, about how I had to tell her that her husband of 50 years had died when I knew that he might not have if we'd gotten him to a real hospital when I first asked for evacuation. The cruise industry markets itself as safe, regulated, providing quality care to passengers. What they don't advertise is that ship medical centers are basically well-equipped first aid stations, that the doctors working on ships often have their hands tied by corporate policies, that medical decisions get overruled by business decisions regularly, that when you get seriously sick on a cruise ship, especially during a crisis that the company wants to manage quietly, you might not get the level of care you'd receive on land. Cooper's name was actually Robert Patterson. I'm using a different name here to protect his family's privacy, but he deserves to be remembered as more than a statistic in a norovirus outbreak report. He was a real person, a husband, A father. Someone celebrating a milestone anniversary with the woman he loved. He died because proper medical care was available, but corporate policy prevented me from providing it. His family deserves to know that. Every passenger boarding a cruise ship deserves to know that when things go seriously wrong, the ship's medical capabilities are limited and corporate considerations might delay or prevent the care you need. I became a doctor to save lives. I watched a man die because treating him properly would have exposed an outbreak the company was trying to manage quietly. That's not something I can forgive myself for, even though I understand the impossible position I was in. Cooper deserved better. His family deserved honesty. And passengers deserve to know the truth about medical care limitations on cruise ships before they sail. If you or someone you know ever got seriously sick on a cruise and felt like the medical response was inadequate or delayed, drop your experience below because these stories need to be heard. My name is Logan, and for 6 years I worked as a ship photographer on some of the largest cruise vessels operating in the Caribbean. When people think about ship photographers, they picture someone taking cheesy formal portraits at dinner or candid shots by the pool. That's part of the job, sure. But what most passengers don't realize is that photographers have access to areas and systems that give us a unique view of everything happening on board. We're everywhere, we're invisible, and we see things that were never meant to be documented. Ship photographers occupy this strange position in the cruise hierarchy. We're not quite passenger-facing crew like the entertainment staff, but we're not behind the scenes like engineering either. We move through all areas of the ship with our cameras, shooting promotional content, capturing passenger moments, documenting events. We have badges that open doors to crew areas, technical spaces, even access to security camera systems when we need footage for promotional videos or incident documentation. Nobody questions a photographer wandering around with a camera. We blend into the background of cruise ship life. The job itself is straightforward on the surface. Wake up early to shoot sunrise photos. Capture embarkation day excitement. Work the dining rooms during dinner service. Photograph deck parties and shows. Create those memory moments that passengers buy at the photo gallery. Process hundreds of images every night. Upload them to the ship's server. Tag them for easy searching. It's repetitive, but it pays decently, and you get to travel, see ports, meet people from around the world. What changed my perspective on the job was discovering the deletion system about 8 months into my first contract. I'd been organizing files on the photo server, creating folders for different events, when I noticed something odd. There were gaps in the file numbering sequence. My camera automatically numbers every image sequentially, so if I take 300 photos in a day, they'll be numbered consecutively. But in the server archives, certain numbers were missing. Not just 1 or 2, but entire blocks of sequential images just gone. I asked my supervisor about it, a guy who'd been shooting ships for 12 years. He got uncomfortable immediately, told me not to worry about it, said sometimes files get corrupted during upload and have to be removed. That explanation didn't make sense, because corrupted files would still show up as damaged files, not just disappear entirely. I started paying closer attention to my own uploads, noting which images I'd shot each day and cross-referencing them with what actually appeared on the server the next morning. Images were being deleted regularly, not random ones. Specific photos from specific times and locations. I started keeping backup copies of everything I shot, storing them on personal hard drives that I kept in my cabin. That's when I realized what was being removed. The deleted images captured things the cruise line didn't want documented. Crew altercations, passengers in distress, equipment malfunctions, incidents that would raise questions if they became part of the official photo record. One of the first significant deletions I caught was from a port day in Cozumel. I'd been shooting around the ship while most passengers were ashore, getting photos of the empty decks for promotional material. I'd wandered near the crew stairwell on deck 4 and heard shouting. 2 crew members, both from the engine department, were in a physical fight. Serious violence. Not just pushing, one guy had the other against the wall, blood visible on both of them. I'd instinctively raised my camera and taken 3 shots before they noticed me and separated. I reported the fight to security, provided the photos as documentation. The next day, those images were gone from the server. When I checked my backup files, I still had them. The fight had definitely happened. I'd documented it clearly. But according to the ship's official photo archive, those images never existed. I asked security what had happened with my report. They told me it had been handled internally, that both crew members had been counseled, that no further action was necessary. I started documenting everything I shot more carefully after that. Kept detailed logs of what I photographed, when, and where. Cross-referenced my logs with what appeared on the server. The pattern became obvious quickly. Anything that could create liability, bad publicity, or questions about ship operations got deleted, usually within 24 hours of upload. The deletions weren't just my photos either. The ship had security cameras throughout public areas, and photographers occasionally got access to that footage when we needed specific shots for promotional videos, or when security asked us to pull stills from camera feeds for incident reports. I started noticing that security footage had the same gaps. Certain time frames from certain camera locations would just be missing from the archived footage. There was an incident during my second year that really crystallized how deliberately this system worked. I'd been shooting sunset photos from the upper decks, working my way around the ship to get different angles of the light on the water. I ended up on Deck 10 aft, an area that's usually pretty empty during dinner time. I was setting up my shot when I noticed movement in one of the cabin windows, a deck below me. Something about it caught my attention. I adjusted my telephoto lens and looked closer. What I saw through that cabin window disturbed me deeply. It looked like a violent struggle. Two people, one clearly trying to restrain the other, furniture knocked over, the kind of scene that indicated something seriously wrong was happening. I took several photos documenting what I could see, then immediately went to find security. I showed the photos to the officer on duty, explained what I'd witnessed. He took my camera, reviewed the images, called his supervisor. Within an hour, I was called to a meeting with the security chief and a corporate representative who'd been conferenced in via satellite. They reviewed my photos. Confirmed they showed what I'd described. Then they told me the situation had been handled. The passengers involved had been dealt with appropriately, and I needed to delete the images immediately. When I hesitated, they made it clear this wasn't a request. The images violated passenger privacy. Taking photos through cabin windows, even accidentally, violated company policy. If I didn't delete them voluntarily, I'd be written up for policy violations, and the images would be confiscated anyway. I deleted them from my camera while they watched. But I'd already backed up the files to my personal drive that morning as part of my routine. The official version became that I'd seen something unclear through a window, reported it out of abundance of caution. Security had investigated and found nothing concerning. The photos never existed. The incident never happened, except I still had the images. I knew what I'd seen, and the next morning, those passengers disembarked at our port stop with what the crew was told was a family emergency, requiring them to leave the cruise early. I never found out what actually happened in that cabin. Never learned if anyone faced consequences. The official record showed nothing unusual occurred. I started compiling a personal archive of deleted files. Hundreds of images over the years. Some showed crew members in fights or arguments. Some documented equipment failures or safety issues. Some captured passengers in various states of distress or dangerous situations. Many showed things I couldn't fully understand without context, but that someone in the company had decided needed to be erased from the official record. There were photos of a passenger sleepwalking on an outer deck multiple nights in a row, getting dangerously close to the railing. I'd reported it. Security supposedly handled it, but the images disappeared. Photos of crew members in unauthorized areas during off hours. Images of what looked like drug transactions in secluded deck spaces. Documentation of sanitation issues in galley areas that should have triggered health inspections. All of it deleted from official archives. All of it preserved in my private collection. The most unsettling discovery was realizing how much of my job was actually about creating an alternative reality. The images that stayed on the server, the ones that got sold to passengers or used in promotional materials, showed a perfect cruise experience. Happy families, romantic sunsets, exciting entertainment, flawless service. Everything that contradicted that narrative got systematically removed. We weren't just memory makers. We were memory editors. Curating which version of events became the official truth. I talked to other ship photographers when I could, during crew parties, or at port, when ships from the same company would dock near each other. Every single one of them knew about the deletion system. Every one of them had seen images disappear. Some kept their own backup archives like I did. Others had learned not to photograph anything that might cause problems. Point the camera at safe subjects. Avoid documenting anything that could create complications. It was safer that way. The breaking point came about 4 months ago during what should have been a routine embarkation day shoot. I was photographing passengers, boarding, getting those excited first day of vacation shots. I noticed commotion near the gangway. Moved closer to see what was happening. Security was detaining someone, a crew member from the look of the uniform. There was an intense confrontation happening. Multiple security officers involved. The detained crew member clearly resisting. I photographed the scene because documenting incidents was technically part of my job when security might need evidence. Later that day, I got called to the security office. The chief wanted my camera. Said there'd been a personnel issue that morning. They needed any photos I might have taken during a specific time frame. I handed over my camera, watched him review the images from the gangway incident. He nodded, thanked me, then deleted every single photo from that morning. Not just the incident. Everything. My entire embarkation day shoot gone. He told me that the crew member had been removed from the ship for policy violations. That it was a personnel matter. That no documentation was needed. When I pointed out that he'd deleted photos of passengers that had nothing to do with the incident, he said it was easier to remove the whole time frame than sort through individual images. I could reshoot embarkation if I needed those photos. The incident photos were company property and had been handled appropriately. I still had backups, of course. I always did. But that interaction made me realize how completely the system controlled the narrative. Security could delete whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted, for whatever reason they deemed necessary. Photographers were just tools for creating the approved version of events. I've left cruise ships now. Took a job shooting weddings and corporate events on land. The pay is less consistent, but at least I own my own work, make my own decisions about what gets kept or deleted. But I still have those archive drives. Hundreds of deleted images from 6 years of shooting cruise ships. Evidence of things that officially never happened. Every cruise ship photographer has files like mine. We all see things that don't make it into the photo galleries or promotional videos. We all know that the images passengers see represent a carefully curated reality that bears only partial resemblance to what actually happens on board. The perfect vacation photos hide a much more complicated truth. I'm sharing this because people should understand that when you look at cruise photos, you're seeing what the company wants you to see. The real images, the ones that show problems or incidents or anything that might raise questions, those get deleted before you ever know they existed. The memory makers are also memory destroyers, and the official record of your cruise vacation is a sanitized version of events. What I documented in my deleted files isn't just random incidents. It's a pattern of systematic erasure of anything that contradicts the cruise line's carefully constructed image. Fights get erased. Safety issues disappear. Passenger distress gets removed from the record. Everything that might suggest cruise ships aren't perfectly safe, perfectly managed floating resorts gets eliminated from the official photographic history. Those drives are locked away now. Archived evidence that I'll probably never use but can't bring myself to delete. Part of me thinks they should be released, that people deserve to know the full truth about what happens on cruise ships. Part of me knows that doing so would accomplish nothing, except ruining any chance I have of working in travel photography again. So they sit in storage while I shoot weddings and tell myself I made the right choice by keeping quiet. If you've ever felt like the official photos from your cruise didn't quite match your memories of what actually happened during your trip, comment below because I'm curious how much passengers notice versus what we capture and delete. My name is Wesley, and I've worked maintenance on cruise ships for 5 years now, specializing in plumbing and HVAC systems. Most passengers never think about the infrastructure that keeps a floating city running. They turn on the tap and water flows. They adjust the thermostat and temperature changes. They flush toilets and waste disappears. Behind all that convenience is a maze of pipes, ducts, pumps, and machinery spread across multiple decks that most crew members never see, let alone passengers. The lower decks of cruise ships are like a hidden world, poorly mapped sections that exist in blueprints from decades ago, but don't match current ship configurations. That's where I spend most of my working hours, in spaces that feel forgotten by time. The layout of a cruise ship makes sense on the upper decks where passengers live. Numbered cabins in logical sequences, clearly marked corridors, elevators that go where you expect. But descend below deck 2, and everything becomes disorienting. Corridors that dead-end unexpectedly. Stairwells that don't appear on digital maps. Storage areas marked on old schematics that seem to have vanished in renovations. The ship I work on is 28 years old, refurbished multiple times, and each renovation added layers of complexity to the lower deck infrastructure. Systems built on top of older systems. New pipes routed around old equipment that was sealed off rather than removed. It creates a labyrinth that even experienced maintenance crew can get lost in. Emergency calls are part of the job. Burst pipes, equipment failures, flooding situations that need immediate response regardless of what time it is or where the problem is located. I've been woken up at 3 in the morning to deal with issues in parts of the ship I'd never accessed before. You grab your tools, follow the emergency locator information, and figure out the problem on site. Most of the time it's straightforward. Fix the immediate issue, file a report, schedule proper repairs for later. But sometimes you stumble into situations that don't have straightforward explanations. The call came in during a sea day, mid-afternoon, when most passengers were at the pool or attending activities. My radio crackled with an urgent request from engineering. Flooding reported in a section marked as ballast tank storage on deck 1, far forward in the bow section. The location seemed odd because ballast tanks are sealed systems, not areas where flooding should occur from pipe failures. But the automated sensors were showing water accumulation, pressure changes indicating active flow. I grabbed Aiden, another maintenance tech who'd been on ships longer than me, and we headed down. Getting to the reported location required navigating through crew corridors I'd rarely used, then descending a steep stairwell that felt older than the rest of the ship. The paint was different down there, chipped and faded in a way that suggested this area hadn't been maintained in years. The lighting was dimmer, fewer fixtures than standard crew areas. The air smelled wrong, metallic and stale, with an underlying dampness that indicated poor ventilation. Aiden mentioned that he'd never been this far forward on the lower decks, that this section wasn't part of normal maintenance routes. We found the flooding source eventually, following the sound of running water and checking valve locations against our digital maps. But when we arrived at the coordinates where the leak should have been, we encountered something that didn't match any schematic we had. The area marked as ballast tank on our current blueprints was actually a corridor lined with doors. Old crew cabin doors with manual locks and small nameplate holders. The style was outdated, the kind of crew quarters ships stopped using in the late 90s when regulations changed and crew accommodation standards improved. The flooding was coming from a burst pipe in the corridor ceiling, water cascading down and pooling on the deck. We could fix that easily enough. But the existence of this corridor, these cabins, raised immediate questions. Aiden checked the blueprints again on his tablet. According to current ship configuration, we were standing in empty ballast space. This entire section had supposedly been gutted and converted during a major renovation 15 years ago. Yet here we were, in intact crew quarters that clearly hadn't been touched in decades. We needed to shut off water to the damaged pipe, which meant accessing the valve system in one of the cabins. I tried the first door. Locked. The second door opened with resistance, hinges protesting from years of disuse. Inside was a crew cabin frozen in time. 2 bunks with bedding still made, though covered in mildew and rust stains. Personal items on the small desk. Photos stuck to the walls showing crew members in uniforms from another era. A calendar visible on the wall showed dates from 1998. Everything was covered in corrosion and decay, but clearly recognizable as a lived-in space that had been abandoned suddenly. Aiden and I exchanged looks. This didn't make sense. Ships get refurbished constantly. Crew quarters get updated or repurposed. You don't just seal off entire sections with personal belongings still inside. I pulled out my phone and took several photos, documenting what we were seeing. The personal items, the dates, the condition of everything. Aiden started checking other cabins. Most were locked, but a few opened. Each one showed the same pattern. Crew quarters abandoned with belongings still present. Everything deteriorating from years of neglect and water damage. What disturbed me most were marks we found on the inside of several cabin doors. Deep scratches in the metal, concentrated around the locking mechanisms. The kind of marks that suggested someone had been trying desperately to get out. Some doors showed damage on the inside that didn't match the external condition, like they'd been secured from the outside, and people inside had tried to force them open. We located the water valve and shut it off, stopping the immediate flooding. But we couldn't ignore what we'd found. This wasn't just an abandoned section. This was evidence of something that had happened to crew members, something that ended with their quarters being sealed off and officially erased from ship records. I radioed our supervisor Isaiah, explained that we'd found the leak but needed him to come see the location because there were serious discrepancies between the blueprints and actual ship configuration. Isaiah arrived 20 minutes later, worked his way through the corridor we'd navigated. His reaction when he saw the crew quarters told me he hadn't known they were here either. He walked through several cabins, examined the belongings, looked at the dates, saw the scratch marks on the doors. Then he made a call to the bridge. I couldn't hear the full conversation, but I heard his side. Confirmation of the location, description of what we'd found, then a long silence while he listened. When Isaiah ended the call, his expression had changed. He told us we needed to complete the pipe repair immediately, and then seal this entire section back up exactly as we'd found it. We were not to document what we'd seen, not to mention it to other crew members, not to include any details about the crew quarters in our maintenance reports. The official work order would reflect that we'd repaired a pipe leak in a ballast tank access corridor. Nothing more. I started to ask questions. Isaiah cut me off. He said this was coming directly from the captain and from corporate. This section of the ship didn't exist according to current configuration. Whatever we'd found was part of the ship's history that had been officially closed. Our job was to fix the pipe and restore the area to sealed condition. If we had problems following those instructions, we could discuss it with human resources and likely find ourselves reassigned to different positions or off the ship entirely. We completed the pipe repair in silence. Then we sealed the access points we'd opened, secured the corridor entrance behind us, and submitted maintenance reports that described routine work in a ballast tank area. The photos I'd taken on my phone I kept to myself, didn't mention them in any official context, but I couldn't let it go. Over the following weeks, I researched the ship's history through available channels, old crew forums, maritime records, industry publications. I found references to this vessel undergoing emergency modifications in late 1998. A section of crew quarters on Deck 1 had been decommissioned following an unspecified incident. The official story was that those quarters had been removed during the modification, the space converted to technical use. But that wasn't true. The quarters were still there, sealed away. Personal belongings of crew members abandoned inside. I tried to find details about what incident had triggered the decommissioning. Nothing specific appeared in any public records I could access, just vague references to regulatory compliance issues and crew accommodation upgrades. But the timeline was wrong for a standard upgrade. Ships don't abandon entire crew sections with belongings still inside for routine renovations. Something had happened that required immediate action, rapid sealing of that area, and apparently permanent removal of those quarters from official ship documentation. The scratches on the inside of the doors haunted me. They indicated panic, desperation, people trying to escape from spaces they'd been locked into. I couldn't reconcile that with any legitimate explanation. Even in emergency situations, crew members wouldn't be locked into quarters. Evacuation procedures required the opposite, ensuring everyone could exit their spaces quickly. I talked quietly with other long-term maintenance crew, trying to find anyone who remembered 1998 or knew about the sealed section. Most had no knowledge of it. But one older technician who'd worked various ships in the fleet for over 20 years pulled me aside during a port day. He told me he'd heard rumors about an incident on this ship involving crew illness, some kind of outbreak that had affected dozens of workers. The company had quarantined the infected crew in their quarters, sealed the section to prevent spread. He didn't know details about how it ended, but said the official story about renovation was cover for something the company wanted buried. That explanation fit some of what I'd seen, but raised even more disturbing questions. If crew members had been quarantined in those cabins, what happened to them? The belongings suggested sudden abandonment. The scratch marks suggested people had been desperate to get out. The sealed section and falsified blueprints suggested the company wanted no trace of those events remaining accessible. I walk over that section every day now. It's directly below crew areas I access regularly for normal maintenance work. I know it's down there. Those cabins with their rotting belongings and desperate scratch marks on the doors. I know the ship's official documentation says that space doesn't exist. And I know that corporate's response to us finding it was to order it sealed back up and forgotten again rather than explaining what actually happened there. Aiden and I don't talk about it. Isaiah made clear that discussing it would end our employment. But I still have the photos on my phone, backed up to personal storage. Evidence that an entire section of crew quarters exists in a space that officially contains nothing but ballast tanks. Evidence of personal items abandoned in 1998 and left to decay for over 25 years. Evidence of scratch marks that suggest something terrible happened to the people who lived in those cabins. The ship continues operating normally. Passengers have no idea that 4 decks below their cabins is a sealed section containing the abandoned quarters of crew members who disappeared from official records decades ago. Current crew members walk these corridors unaware that parts of the ship they think they know have been deliberately hidden from documentation and memory. I've requested transfer to a different ship. Can't work on this vessel anymore knowing what's sealed below. Knowing that the company's response to discovery wasn't investigation or explanation, but orders to hide it again and pretend we'd seen nothing. Whatever happened in 1,998 inches, those lower deck crew quarters, the cruise line has spent over 2 decades ensuring it stays buried. The transfer paperwork is processing now. I don't know if it'll be approved or if my request triggers questions about why I want off this specific ship. But I can't keep walking over that sealed section. Can't keep pretending I don't know it's there. Those scratch marks on the doors mean someone was trapped. The abandoned belongings mean people left or were removed suddenly. The company's reaction means they know exactly what happened and have no intention of ever acknowledging it. If you've ever worked on ships or in industries where you discovered evidence of something disturbing from the past that you were ordered to keep quiet about, share your story in the comments because I need to know. This kind of cover-up isn't unique to cruise lines. My name is Jade, and I work as a nurse practitioner in cruise ship medical centers. 8 years I've been doing this. Started right out of my emergency room residency, thinking ship medicine would be a calmer application of my trauma training. I was wrong about the calm part. But the ER background turned out to be essential. Because when things go catastrophically wrong on a ship in the middle of the ocean, you become the entire medical system for thousands of people with resources that wouldn't sustain a small-town urgent care clinic for a week. You make decisions that should never fall to one person, and you live with the consequences of those decisions forever. The medical center on my current ship serves just over 3,000 passengers and about 1,200 crew members. Our staff consists of 1 physician, 2 registered nurses, and me. We have basic diagnostic equipment, limited medications, some monitoring capability, and exactly 6 beds for critical patients. In normal circumstances, that's adequate. We handle seasickness, minor injuries, medication refills, the occasional cardiac event that we stabilize before arranging helicopter evacuation. The system works because we're never more than a few hours from advanced medical facilities on land, either by aircraft or by diverting to the nearest port. But normal circumstances don't account for situations where evacuation becomes impossible and multiple critical patients arrive simultaneously. That's when cruise ship medicine reveals itself as fundamentally inadequate for true emergencies. And medical professionals like me face choices that shouldn't exist in any healthcare setting. The storm hit us on day 4 of a 7-day voyage through the Western Caribbean. Weather forecasts had shown rough seas, but nothing catastrophic. The captain had assured passengers we'd experience some motion, but the ship was designed to handle it. What the forecasts hadn't predicted was the intensity spike that turned moderate swells into something far more dangerous. Within 2 hours, we went from uncomfortable rolling to violent pitching that sent unsecured items flying and passengers tumbling across public areas. The first injury calls started around 6 in the evening. Broken bones, head trauma, lacerations requiring stitches. Standard storm-related injuries that we could manage. My nursing staff handled the minor cases while I focused on anything serious. The physician on duty, an experienced maritime doctor who'd worked ships for 15 years, coordinated our response and decided who needed immediate attention versus who could wait. Then the major wave hit. I felt it through the entire ship, an impact that seemed to lift us and slam us back down. The lights flickered. Alarms started sounding, and my radio exploded with emergency calls. Mass casualties in the main dining room where the wave had sent people and furniture crashing across the space. Multiple serious injuries. People trapped under overturned tables. Blood everywhere. We went into full crisis mode. Called all off-duty medical staff to report immediately. Converted the small medical center waiting area into triage. Prepared every available bed and monitoring station. Within 20 minutes, we had injured passengers flooding in faster than we could assess them. Broken limbs, head injuries, internal trauma, bleeding that wouldn't stop. The nurses worked frantically, doing initial assessments, categorizing injuries, trying to stabilize the worst cases. I counted 11 critical patients in the first 30 minutes. Critical meaning they needed intensive monitoring, possible surgical intervention, resources we simply didn't have. We had 6 beds, 6 monitoring stations, 2 ventilators, limited blood supply, no way to do major surgery, and the storm was intensifying, making helicopter evacuation impossible and preventing us from diverting to port for at least 12 more hours, according to the captain's update. The physician pulled me aside for a brutal conversation. We had to prioritize, had to make decisions about who got our limited resources and who would receive comfort care only. Had to perform battlefield triage in a situation where everyone deserved full hospital-level treatment, but we could only provide intensive care to a fraction of the critical patients. He wanted my input because some of these decisions would fall to me if he became overwhelmed managing the most acute cases. We established categories quickly. Red tags for immediate life-threatening injuries requiring our full resources. Yellow tags for serious injuries that were stable enough to wait. Green tags for minor injuries that could be handled with basic care, and black tags for patients whose injuries were too severe to survive with our available resources, where intensive treatment would consume equipment needed for patients with better survival odds. The hardest category was deciding between 2 red-tagged patients when we only had resources for 1. That's where medical training meets impossible ethics. In a real hospital, you treat everyone. In a battlefield, you accept that resources are finite. On a cruise ship during a storm, you exist in this horrible middle ground where modern medical capabilities are right there on land but completely unreachable. 2 patients arrived within minutes of each other. Both critical. Both needing our last available ventilator and intensive monitoring station. The first was a young passenger, 28 years old, traveling with his new wife on their honeymoon. Severe head trauma from being thrown against a pillar during the wave impact. Unconscious, irregular breathing, showing signs of brain injury, but vital signs were relatively stable with manual airway support. With proper intensive care and hospital neurosurgery, good chance of survival. Without it, uncertain but possible he could deteriorate rapidly. The second patient was a man in his early 70s, traveling with his adult children. Crushed chest from furniture that had pinned him during the chaos. Internal bleeding we couldn't stop without surgery. Respiratory distress from damaged lungs. Vital signs, unstable and declining. With immediate hospital intervention, maybe a 30% survival chance. Without intensive support, he'd likely die within hours from the internal injuries and breathing failure. I had 1 ventilator available, 1 intensive monitoring bed, resources to fully support 1 patient. The physician was managing 2 other critical cases and couldn't make this decision in the moment. He told me to use my judgment, trust my triage training, make the call that gave us the best outcomes overall. I looked at both patients. The young man had better vital signs, better survival odds, decades of life ahead of him. The older man was deteriorating faster, needed more resources, had less chance of survival even with everything we could provide. Medical triage protocols were clear. You allocate limited resources to maximize lives saved. That meant prioritizing the patient with better survival probability. I made the decision. Put the young patient on the ventilator, moved him to the intensive monitoring bed, assigned one of my nurses to provide constant care. The older man I moved to a regular bed, put on high-flow oxygen, gave him pain medication, and did everything possible to keep him comfortable and stable with the resources I could spare. I told his family I was doing everything I could, which was true but incomplete. What I didn't tell them was that I'd made an active choice to prioritize another patient's survival over his. For 4 hours I managed that medical center while the storm continued battering us. Treated dozens of patients, stabilized injuries, coordinated care across multiple critical cases. The young patient on the ventilator remained stable. The older man declined gradually despite our efforts. His breathing got worse, his blood pressure dropped. His family held his hands and talked to him while I administered medication to keep him from suffering. He died at 11:30 that night, about 4 hours before the Coast Guard helicopter was finally able to reach us for emergency evacuations. The young patient survived, was airlifted to a hospital in Miami, underwent surgery, eventually recovered with some lingering neurological effects, but alive and functional. The older man never had a chance once I made the decision to allocate our resources elsewhere. The official medical report stated that we'd treated multiple casualties from storm-related injuries with limited resources, that we'd provided appropriate care given the circumstances, that one patient had succumbed to injuries too severe to manage in our facility. All technically accurate. What the report didn't include was that I'd made a choice between 2 lives and one patient died partly because I decided the other deserved our intensive care more. The family of the deceased man was devastated but understanding. They knew the storm had been catastrophic, that the medical center had been overwhelmed, that we'd done our best. They didn't know that their father might have survived if I'd put him on that ventilator instead, that in a real hospital with adequate resources, both patients could have received intensive care, that I'd played God with finite equipment and chosen youth over age, better odds over worse odds. I don't regret the decision from a medical standpoint. Triage protocols exist for exactly these situations. When resources are limited, you maximize survival by prioritizing patients with the best chances. I'd make the same call again if faced with identical circumstances. The young patient lived specifically because I allocated resources to him instead of the older patient. That's one life saved that might have been lost if I'd decided differently, but I struggle with the moral weight of it. The older patient's name was Roman. He was a retired teacher traveling with his children to celebrate his retirement. He'd spent 40 years educating students, raised a family, was looking forward to this new chapter of his life. He died on the floor of a cruise ship medical center because when I had to choose between him and a younger patient, I chose the younger one. His family thinks he died because his injuries were too severe. They don't know that with different resource allocation, he might have had a chance. The cruise line's investigation concluded that all medical decisions were appropriate given the crisis circumstances. No fault was assigned. The families of both patients received settlements with non-disclosure agreements. The young patient's family probably doesn't know that their son survived partly because another patient was deprioritized. Roman's family doesn't know that full intensive care was available but given to someone else. What haunts me isn't the decision itself but the system that forced it. Cruise ships market themselves as floating resorts with full medical facilities. They show passengers pictures of clean medical centers with modern equipment. They don't explain that those facilities are designed for routine issues, not mass casualties. They don't mention that, in true emergencies, the medical staff has resources comparable to a small urgent care clinic trying to serve a town of 5,000 people. If Roman had collapsed at home, he'd have been in a real hospital within 20 minutes, with full trauma teams and operating rooms available. Instead, he was on a ship in a storm, with one doctor, 2 nurses, 1 nurse practitioner, and equipment sufficient for exactly 6 intensive care patients when we had 11 who needed that level of care. The storm didn't kill him. The inadequacy of cruise ship medical infrastructure killed him. My triage decision just determined which inadequately served patient would die first. I'm still working cruise ships because I can make a difference for most patients most of the time. But I'm advocating within the industry for better medical capabilities on these vessels. More staff, more equipment, better emergency protocols. The response has been that enhanced medical facilities are cost prohibitive and that serious emergencies are rare enough that current resources are adequate. They point to statistics showing most voyages complete without major medical incidents. What those statistics don't capture is what happens during the incidents that do occur. How medical professionals are forced into impossible decisions because corporate budgets prioritize profit margins over comprehensive emergency capabilities. How families receive sanitized explanations that omit the resource limitations that contributed to their loved ones' deaths. How patients who deserved full hospital care receive crisis-level triage because the ship is too far from land and too poorly equipped to provide what they need. Roman deserved better than dying on a cruise ship with inadequate medical resources. The young patient deserved not to owe his survival to my decision to deprioritize someone else. Both deserve to be in a real hospital, where triage wouldn't mean choosing who lives because we can't treat everyone. But cruise ships aren't real hospitals, no matter how much the marketing materials suggest otherwise. And when emergencies exceed our limited capabilities, people die who might have survived on land. I carry that knowledge every shift. Every time I walk into the medical center, I see those 6 beds and know that if we get 7 critical patients, someone will receive substandard care. Someone will be the Roman of that crisis, the patient who loses the resource allocation lottery, and I'll be the one making that choice again, living with it again, knowing that the industry could prevent these situations but chooses not to because adequate medical infrastructure doesn't generate revenue. That's the secret cruise ship medical staff carry. We're not running hospitals. We're running triage centers that look like hospitals, staffed by professionals making impossible choices with inadequate resources, while the company markets our facilities as comprehensive medical care. And when those choices result in deaths that might have been prevented with proper resources, we write sanitized reports and sign off on settlements and carry the weight of those decisions alone. Have you or a family member ever needed serious medical care while on a cruise? And did you feel the level of treatment matched what you'd expect at a hospital on land? Thank you for watching another story here on Mr. Nightveil. If these confessions from cruise ship workers have opened your eyes to what really happens behind the scenes, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. These are the stories they never wanted you to hear, and I'll keep bringing them to you. Stay safe out there, and remember, not everything that happens at sea stays at sea.